On November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a gentleman in his mid-40s walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter at Portland International Airport in Oregon. He was a quiet, unassuming man in dark sunglasses, carrying a black briefcase and wearing a black business suit with a white shirt. As he used cash to purchase a one-way ticket to nearby Seattle, he told the clerk behind the counter that his name was Dan Cooper. Shortly after, Cooper boarded the waiting Boeing 727 and took a seat in the rear of the passenger cabin before ordering a bourbon and soda. The sparsely occupied aircraft took off on schedule at 2:50 p.m. that afternoon for the short 30-minute flight into Washington. Once the flight had reached altitude, flight attendant Florence Schaffner began to walk up and down the aisle, taking drink orders from the passengers. When she reached the row where Dan Cooper was seated and asked him for his order, he simply handed her a note. Miss Schaffner opened it up and gasped when she saw what was written. Written with a felt-tip pen in neat printed capital letters were just 4 words. /I have a bomb /Cooper then invited Florence Schaffner to take a seat next to him. Only it wasn't so much an invitation as an order. According to later statements, Cooper then showed the terrified flight attendant exactly what was in his briefcase. She saw 8 large cylinders linked to a small circular battery unit with red insulation wire. Schaffner had never seen an explosive device before, but the one she saw that afternoon was very, very convincing. Cooper then leaned into her ear before whispering his demands. $200,000 in negotiable American currency, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle, one that was ready to refuel the aircraft once it had landed. Schaffner promptly walked down the aircraft's aisle to the cockpit, relayed Cooper's demands to the pilot, and assured him she had seen the explosive device he was threatening them with. Captain William Scott, the aircraft's pilot, quickly contacted Seattle Airport, informing them of the grave situation on board. Not wishing to cause a panic, the pilot passed a message over the intercom to the passengers on board, telling them that their arrival at Seattle Airport would be slightly delayed due to minor technical difficulties. On its arrival in Seattle airspace, the aircraft entered a holding pattern, circling the area to ensure that local authorities had time to fully assemble the money and parachutes that Cooper had demanded. Meanwhile, the president of the airline in question actually relented to Cooper's demands, personally authorizing the withdrawal of the full $200,000 from company accounts and passing along instructions that all company employees were to fully comply with the hijacker to preserve human life. A remarkable aspect of the hijacking was Cooper's behavior during the whole ordeal. Many aircraft hijackings during that period were hallmarked by the cruelty and political extremism of the perpetrators, such as the German Communist Red Army faction, but flight attendant Florence Schaffner later described Cooper as being well-spoken, calm, and polite, going so far as to pay for his drinks and offer to provide food for the flight attendants when the plane landed in Seattle. At no point did Cooper relate any kind of political motive for the hijacking, and in fact he did not communicate any motives for his actions whatsoever. We can only assume that Cooper was a criminal who merely sought personal gain, but one who showed an unusual amount of compassion and empathy for those involved in the hijacking. At 5:24 p.m., FBI agents on the ground at Seattle Airport, who had gathered Cooper's money from a few different local banks, relayed a message to the pilot that the aircraft was cleared to land. Once it landed, Cooper instructed the pilot to taxi the plane to a well-lit area of the runway, before telling the flight attendants to shut all of the window shades on board to ensure the FBI snipers would be unable to get a clear shot at him. This is one of the first clues we get to just how much thought and planning Cooper had put into the whole operation. Shortly afterward, Northwest Orient Airlines ops manager approached the aircraft in civilian clothing, delivering a set of backpacks that were stuffed with cash to one of the flight attendants via the plane's rear staircase. Once Cooper was happy that the delivery was sufficient, he told all passengers and a handful of the flight crew to disembark, leaving only a skeleton crew to fly him out of there. It was during the refueling of the aircraft that Cooper informed them of their new course. They would be flying southwest towards Mexico City. But Cooper didn't only give them a new direction. He seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the aircraft's functionality, instructing them exactly how he wished the pilot to fly the plane, such as the speed and altitude he wanted them to fly at, even down to the angle at which he wanted the wing flaps to be deployed. He also instructed the pilot to ensure that the cabin remained unpressurized, telling him to leave the rear doors of the aircraft open when the plane took off. An official from the Federal Aviation Administration requested a face-to-face meeting with Cooper, informing him that takeoff would be extremely unsafe given some of the conditions he had requested. It was a bluff. He was counting on Cooper knowing next to nothing about aviation, but Cooper knew far more than anyone had predicted and argued in return that he would only lower the stairs once the plane was in the air. As previously mentioned, it seemed Cooper had planned and researched the operation in extreme forensic detail in the months, or possibly years, leading up to the incident, and came armed with a frightening amount of knowledge surrounding civilian aviation. There was, however, one thing that Cooper apparently did not have knowledge of. He seemed to have expected the aircraft to be able to make one solid flight down to Mexico City, when in fact, it only had a maximum range of about 1,000 miles. The co-pilot informed Cooper that they would have to make a refueling stop at Reno Airport down in Nevada. Cooper agreed but seemed bizarrely unconcerned by such a detail. About 2 hours after they had originally landed, the hijacked aircraft prepared to take off again, with just 5 people on board, 4 crew members and the hijacker himself. However, at this stage, the plane was being tailed by 2 F-106 fighter aircraft that had scrambled from the nearby McChord Air Force Base, one above and one below the hijacked plane, so that Cooper would be unable to see them. After the plane took off, Cooper ordered the entire flight crew into the cockpit, leaving him alone in the cabin. One crew member later noted that they had seen Cooper tying something around his waist before he began to lower the rear staircase. At approximately 1:15 p.m., the aircraft's rear staircase was still lowered when the pilot landed the plane at Reno Airport. A large number of waiting FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, and local Reno PD began to surround the jet and quickly boarded to take Cooper into custody before he had a chance to get airborne again and escape to Mexico. But as they completed a thorough search of the aircraft, they discovered that Cooper was nowhere to be found. All that remained of the man was his black clip-on tie, his tie clip, and 2 of the 4 parachutes as requested as part of his demands. The only possible conclusion to be drawn was that somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Cooper had jumped out of the plane. What followed was arguably the most extensive and intensive search and recovery operation in U.S. history. A series of composite sketches was developed, with local police and FBI agents immediately seeking to question around 800 possible suspects. However, all 20 or so of these were quickly eliminated from the investigation. One of these suspects was an Oregon man by the name of T.B. Cooper, who had a relatively small criminal history. He too was ruled out of the investigation, as just one of the theories was that it was highly unlikely that the hijacker would have used his actual birth name to pull off such a daring heist. But thanks to the details of his questioning being released by reporters, the name /TB Cooper / stuck in public consciousness. Given that Cooper was thought to have jumped out of the aircraft just 20 minutes or so after takeoff, police centered their search on a certain area of Washington, specifically the land around the Lewis River in the southwest of the state. FBI agents and sheriff's deputies from nearby counties searched large areas of the mountainous wilderness surrounding the Lewis River on foot and by helicopter. Door-to-door searches of local farmhouses were also carried out, while search parties ran patrol boats along the river and in surrounding lakes. But no trace of Cooper, nor any of the equipment he was thought to have jumped out of the aircraft with, was ever located. The FBI then attempted to locate a trace of Cooper by releasing a list of serial numbers that were printed on the money they had given him. But this did little more than confuse the situation. In 1972, 2 men used counterfeit $20 bills printed with Cooper's serial numbers to con $30,000 from a Newsweek reporter in exchange for an interview with a man who falsely claimed he was the hijacker. For all intents and purposes, the man who called himself Dan Cooper had successfully completed his criminal operation before he disappeared into thin air. No evidence of Cooper was discovered until February of 1980, when a family vacationing on the Columbia River made a miraculous discovery. As they raked over a sandy riverbank to build a campfire, they uncovered 3 packets worth of the ransom cash that was delivered to Cooper on the tarmac of Seattle Airport. The bills had suffered serious water damage over the years and were heavily deteriorated, but they were soon identified as the genuine article by FBI agents. However, none of the other bills had ever turned up anywhere in the world, despite their serial numbers still being available online for public inspection. But who exactly was Dan Cooper? It might seem obvious, but his financial situation was most likely extremely desperate. Why would a man take such an enormous risk otherwise? But whether or not this was to pay medical bills, debts, or for something more material can only be speculated on. One of the flight attendants told FBI interviewers that Cooper had been able to recognize the city of Tacoma from the air, and also noticed that McChord Air Force Base was less than a half-hour's drive from Seattle Airport, something that few civilians would have been aware of at that time. This has given rise to the idea that Cooper was an Air Force veteran, or at least had a background in aviation, a theory supported by Cooper's apparently expert knowledge of the nature of aircraft. He was aware of flying techniques, engine placement, aircraft specifications, as well as local terrain. He may have also specifically selected the 727 model of aircraft thanks to a recent innovation that allowed all 3 fuel tanks to be refilled at once. Cooper also knew that the rear staircase could be lowered during flight, a fact that was never disclosed to civilian flight crews, since there was no situation on a passenger flight that would make it necessary. He also seemed aware that its operation by a single switch in the rear of the cabin could not be overridden from the cockpit. Some of this knowledge was only known by CIA paramilitary units, so could Cooper have been a former CIA agent, or perhaps a rogue agent? One particularly interesting point is that /Dan Cooper is a name shared by a popular Belgian comic book hero who enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Dan Cooper took part in numerous heroic adventures, including parachuting. Yet the Dan Cooper comics were never translated into English, nor were they imported over to the United States, so there's been much speculation that the hijacker may have encountered them during a tour of duty in Europe during World War I. The comics were not sold in the U.S., but since some copies were translated into French, they were sold in Canada. Cooper could well have been a Canadian citizen. Given that he jumped out of the plane in Washington, his escape plan could have been over the border to his native country, with the whole Mexico reference being a diversionary tactic. In line with this theory, much has been made of his specific demand for /negotiable American currency, a phrase which some determined was unlikely to be used by a U.S. citizen. Despite the fact that no dead body has ever been found, the FBI has long speculated that Cooper did not survive his jump. Parachuting into the stormy Washington wilderness without the right equipment in such terrible conditions, it's unlikely he even got his chute open. And even if Cooper was lucky enough to land safely, survival in the mountainous terrain at the onset of winter would have been all but impossible without an accomplice waiting at an agreed-upon drop zone. This would have required a perfectly timed jump, which would have required cooperation from the flight crew. And there is no evidence that Cooper requested or received any such help from the crew, or that he had any clear idea where he was when he jumped out of the plane. It was also revealed that one of the parachutes they had provided to Cooper had been a dummy, an unusable unit with an inoperative ripcord intended solely as a teaching aid. Although it had clear markings identifying it to any experienced skydiver as non-functional, the FBI stressed that the inclusion of the dummy reserve parachute, one of 4 obtained in haste from a Seattle skydiving school, was accidental and not a deliberate attempt to kill Cooper. The search for D.B. Cooper officially ended on the 8th of July 2016. It was on this date that the FBI announced that it was ending all active investigations, telling the public they needed to focus its investigative resources and manpower elsewhere. Local FBI field offices have stated they will continue to accept any legitimate physical evidence related specifically to the parachutes or the ransom money that may emerge in the future. The 60-volume case file, compiled over the 45-year course of the investigation, will be preserved for historical purposes at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. On the FBI website, there is currently a 28-part packet full of evidence gathered over the years, and all the evidence is open to the public to read. So, keep your eyes and ears open for a man with a little too much in the way of aircraft knowledge, who has a little too much money for a retiree. There's every chance that D.B. Cooper might still be out there, and it might be a listener of this very channel that finally solves the mystery of the greatest airline heist of all time.